Welcome back. This is my podcast. I'm Brandon Cunningham. You can go to brandoncunningham.com and sign up and get this in your email inbox, or almost all podcast players, Spotify, iTunes, all that has it too. So you can go there too. This is chapter 6 of Leviticus, and I understand Leviticus is not the easiest book in the Bible. And some of this stuff is going right over your head. That's okay. Don't worry, because you're planting seeds that we're going to harvest here in a couple of weeks. We're going to see some of this stuff put into play, and it's going to make a lot more sense. You don't have to memorize all the different sacrifices and rituals. You're not in the temple, so they're not really going to apply to you as much as understanding the work that's done. Imagine all of this happening all day, every day, and it all depended on you maintaining a relationship with God. The reason I want you to think about that is because what we have through Yeshua, Jesus the Messiah, is because of all of this, we don't have to do all of that stuff in order to have good standing with God. But that should make us even more grateful for what God's done for us and what He's given us. And the best way to show gratitude is obedience, knowing what He wants and then doing that thing, and not saying, well, this doesn't apply to me, or I'm not convicted of that, or I don't feel the need of that. If God said it, it's right. We're wrong. That's the way it works. So let's jump into Leviticus chapter 6. And again, I'm going to read from the New Living Translation because it's a little easier to understand, and the translations are not that different. So it says, then the Lord said to Moses, suppose one of you sins against your associate and is unfaithful to the Lord. Suppose you cheat in a deal involving a security deposit, or you steal or commit fraud, or you find lost property and lie about it, or you lie while swearing to tell the truth, or you commit any other such sin. If you have sinned in any of these ways, you are guilty. You must give back whatever you stole, or the money you took by extortion, or the security deposit, or the lost property you found, or anything obtained by swearing falsely. You must make restitution by paying the full price plus an additional 20% to the person you have harmed. On the same day, you must present a guilt offering. As a guilt offering to the Lord, you must bring to the priest your own ram with no defects, or you may buy one of equal value. Through this process, the priest will purify you before the Lord, making you right with Him, and you will be forgiven for any of these sins you have committed. Then the Lord said to Moses, and remember, they replaced God's name with Lord to make it all a little bit easier to say that the God of the Old Testament's gone and Jesus is the God of the New Testament, and He's all love and charms and everything else. So other than that, the translation's not really that bad. So then the Lord said to Moses, give Aaron and his sons the following instructions regarding the burnt offering. The burnt offering must be left on top of the altar until the next morning, and the fire on the altar must be kept burning all night. In the morning, after the priest on duty has put on his official linen clothing and linen undergarments, he must clean out the ashes of the burnt offering and put them beside the altar. Then he must take off these garments, change back into his regular clothes, and carry the ashes outside the camp to a place that is ceremonially clean. Meanwhile, the fire on the altar must be kept burning. It must never go out. Each morning, the priest will add fresh wood to the fire and arrange the burnt offering on it. He will then burn the fat of the peace offerings on it. Remember, the fire must be kept burning on the altar at all times. It must never go out. These are the instructions regarding the grain offering. Aaron's sons must present this offering to the Lord in front of the altar. The priest on duty will take from the grain offering a handful of the choice flour moistened with olive oil, together with all the frankincense. He will burn this representative portion on the altar as a pleasing aroma to the Lord. Aaron and his sons may eat the rest of the flour, but it must be baked without yeast and eaten in a sacred place within the courtyard of the tabernacle. Remember, it must never be prepared with yeast. I have given it to the priest as their share of the special gifts presented to me. Like the sin offering and the guilt offering, it is most holy. Any of Aaron's male descendants may eat from the special gifts presented to the Lord. This is their permanent right from generation to generation. Anyone or anything that touches these offerings will become holy. Then the Lord said to Moses, on the day Aaron and his sons are anointed, they must present to the Lord the standard grain offering of 2 quarts of choice flour. Half to be offered in the morning and half to be offered in the evening. It must be carefully mixed with olive oil and cooked on a griddle. Then slice this grain offering and present it as a pleasing aroma to the Lord. In each generation, the high priest who succeeds Aaron must prepare this same offering. It belongs to the Lord, and it must be burned up completely. This is a permanent law. All such grain offerings of a priest must be burned up entirely. None of it may be eaten. Then the Lord said to Moses, give Aaron and his sons the following instructions regarding the sin offering. The animal given as an offering for sin is a most holy offering, and it must be slaughtered in the Lord's presence at the place where the burnt offerings are slaughtered. The priest who offers the sacrifice as a sin offering must eat his portion in a sacred place within the courtyard of the tabernacle. Anyone or anything that touches the sacrificial meat will become holy. If any of the sacrificial blood splatters on a person's clothing, the soiled garment must be washed in a sacred place. If a clay pot is used to boil the sacrificial meat, it must be broken. If a bronze pot is used, it must be scoured and thoroughly rinsed with water. Any male from a priest's family may eat from this offering. It is most holy. But the offering for sin may not be eaten if its blood was brought into the tabernacle as an offering for purification in the holy place. It must be completely burned with fire. So, what? That's a lot of stuff. But remember, chapter 6 and 7 can really be combined, kind of like 4 and 5. These 2 chapters present what is called the Torot, and Torot, the ritual procedures for each of the 5 major categories. So chapters 1 through 5 are instructions for the worshiper, and then chapters 6 and 7 are instructions for the priest. So most sacrifices were to be eaten by the priest or the worshipers, or in some cases shared. Almost all meat that anyone ate was first part of a sacrifice because it cost a lot. It was a sacrifice in every sense. So they weren't just killing animals and eating them. The only animal you really could afford to eat was one that also served as a sacrifice. So the idea was basically that the priests were given some of God's portion. He was taking care of them. We'll see that whenever God doesn't give them land in Canaan, he puts them in different cities around. They are his now. They're not part of the tribe of Israel anymore. They are separated apart. Divide, elect, and separate. That's something God's done throughout the Bible so far. And he'll keep doing it. So the first instruction concerns the Olah, the O-L-A-H, the burnt offering. The fire must be kept burning, and the animal is to remain on the altar all night. And sometimes we go, well, why? What's the purpose of that? It's God's choice. God said it. It's right. Let's do it, is basically what should happen. We don't have the temple now. I'm not telling you to do any of that stuff. So the Olah was conducted daily. 2 one-year-old male sheep, rams. These particular rams were raised for this purpose. They were flocks owned by the priesthood on behalf of all Israel, and they were raised for this purpose, to do the Olah every day. So one was sacrificed in the morning and then the other in the evening. So no sacrificing was done after sundown. The ashes were to be removed and piled up beside the brazen altar. And then the priest changes to move the ash heap. So, you're dealing with ashes and fire and blood and smell and all of that stuff. And they're changing clothes. They're protecting God's holiness and purity the whole time they're doing it. This is a really big deal. Sometimes we just think, well, I can go to church and come and go, and I can go get coffee or milk or a donut or what, go to the bathroom 15 times. We don't really treat anything as extra holy anymore. And that's not a good thing. We should not do that. We should have a little bit more gratitude and obedience about the things set apart for God. But we'll get there hopefully someday. So outside the camp was a place beyond all those hundreds of thousands of tents that were set up around the temple that Israel lived in. And this one little spot was considered to be clean. That is, it was not defiled or common. It wasn't holy, but it wasn't defiled. So this was the place where they were supposed to take it. So the priests were to wear fine linen. They did a lot of trading during this time. Sometimes they would stay at a spot for a year and sometimes a little longer, but they didn't move the whole time. And they were trading all the gold and silver that they had gotten from the Egyptians. So that's why one of the reasons God did that was so they would be able to trade. Because remember, they're not raising crops. They're trying to make cattle and livestock live in the desert and still maintain all of these things. So sometimes we think, well, that's too hard. Well, God asked way more of the Hebrews than he's asked of any other people in the world. And he's given Gentiles, Christians, more than he's given anybody else in the world. And we're not as grateful. We don't want to go to as much. Like, what if I couldn't eat bacon? That would just be terrible. Really? That's the worst thing that God could ask of you, is a little bit of sacrifice in that sense. But in the New Testament, all these Levitical rituals were still being performed. The temple was there. That was all still going on. Now, the coals on the altar of incense came from the coals produced by the brazen altar. So if the brazen altar was quenched, they couldn't offer incense to Jehovah anymore and get his attention and be in a good place with him. So it was a lot of work all the time. So in 1 Thessalonians, Paul says, do not quench the spirit. And he was using the analogy of quenching the perpetual brazen altar fire. The advent of Yeshua, the Spirit of God is placed in every believer now. And so that holy fire burns inside of us now. And we're supposed to not quench the Holy Spirit, because that brings the same result as quenching the altar fire. God's presence will vanish. That's why we don't want to quench the spirit in our hearts by just loading it full of bad stuff and not focusing on what God wants us to focus on. So beginning in verse 7, we move to the mincha rituals, and the priest were required to eat the mincha offering. A portion of the flour must be used to make unleavened cakes, and it was these cakes that the priest were to eat. It was usually inside the courtyard of the tabernacle, and they would usually eat them at the door while they're standing there. So in verse 10, we're told that this food is classified as kodashim, and it means most sacred offerings. All the offerings of chapter 6 and the first few verses of chapter 7 are classified as most sacred. Verse 11 tells us that only Aaron's male descendants can eat of this portion. Because while all of Aaron's descendants are Levites, not all Levites are Aaron's descendants. So Aaron's descendants are called Cohen, priest. If a person is a Cohen, they are a blood descendant of Aaron and entitled to be a priest. But the tribe of Levi was made up of many families. They worked in the temple, but they weren't qualified to be priests. He separated, divided, and elected out just Aaron's family. And so the other Levite family and their descendants, they were all given other duties in the temple, but they weren't the priests. Those all came from Aaron. So holiness generally cannot be transferred by physical touch, but uncleanness, unholiness can. Holiness must be carefully guarded. It can be transmitted, but it generally cannot be just by physical touch. So next is an offering in Hebrew called the korban, Korban, and only priest can present these, and this is for them to cleanse themselves. So chapter 6 was spoken also before the tabernacle was built. So none of this stuff's going on yet in our story. So beginning on the day that Aaron and his sons are consecrated as priests, the instructions for the tabernacle will take effect, and then they'll happen from then on. God's still giving all of this to Moses at this point. None of it's actually taken place yet. So the Olah involved one ram in the morning and a second in the evening. So this half quart of grain was offered. It was sacrificed in the morning and the other half in the evening. None of the mincha prayers or offering of the priest could be eaten. Their own sacrifice, they couldn't eat it. It had to be consumed by the fire of the brazen altar. So they couldn't benefit from their own sacrifice. So verses 17 through 22 discuss the priest role in the Hadadat, and is brought by the worshiper. So what they do when the worshiper brings it. It changes in verse 23 to discuss what must occur during Hadadat sacrifices brought on behalf of the priesthood or the whole congregation. There's three different kinds. The priests do it, or it's the worshiper, or it's on behalf of everyone. Those are all three different, and God set three different rules for them. So verse 23 defines those special sacrifices as times when the blood from the sacrifice is brought into the sanctuary to be sprinkled around inside the holy place, or on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, when it is used inside the Holy of Holies. So God makes some exceptions and then sets down the rules for those. And the key there is when God decides it, it's right. If we make exceptions and we make compromise, we're wrong. We're changing what God wanted. He didn't say, hey, do this if it's not too hard or you can afford it or it's easy. He said, do this. And that's what we're supposed to do. So that's Leviticus chapter 6. Share this. Send me your questions, comments, whatever you want to know, and we'll try to jump in there and cover as much as we can. God bless. Love God, love people, and change the world.